from Kansas State University, Master of Science in Economics from the University of North Texas, and the BA in Economics from Makerere University in Uganda. Dr. Ojede teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses in macroeconomics, international economics, and money and banking. Dr. Ojede's research interests focus on the intersection between macroeconomics and international economics, regional economic analysis and growth, productivity analysis, and international development. His work involves extending structural macroeconometric models to address numerous propagation mechanisms of macroeconomic policy shocks on the aggregate economy. On the international economics and development front, Dr. Ojede studies issues related to globalization regarding worker remittances, financial and capital movements, such as foreign direct investments. His work has been published in highly regarded peer-reviewed regional, national, and international economic journals. Dr. Ojede also consults with several international organizations and research foundations in the United States. Dr. Ojede's current research using space-time dynamic effects of foreign direct investments on economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa has recently been published in the World Economy. Dr. Ojede is also currently working on research which builds human capital formation into the dynamic effects, dynamic models of economic growth for African economies. Andrew, thank you for joining us today with your presentation, and stage is yours.
Oh, thank you very much for that elaborate introduction, Burak. I'm really honored to be here today to talk about this piece of work, which we've been working on for a couple of years. So this current work is basically a continuation of what I've already done in international economic field, especially on capital movements in developing economies. So this work is jointly co-authored by Yao Yu and Ruby Kishan. They're both of my colleagues here in the Department of Finance and Economics. But I just want to talk, Burak already hinted what my core research are. You know, I do a lot of research on macroeconomics. Some of my research spill over to regional economic growth and analysis. I've been studying a lot the impact of macroeconomic shocks, policy shocks like fiscal policy in subnational US state economies. You know, so a lot of my work has appeared in some regional and national journals in that particular field of research. But most of my core areas, basically, I try to look at issues regarding foreign direct investments, portfolio investments, and diaspora remittances, because these are aspects of globalization. The trajectory of these three main forms of globalization have really increased over the past couple of decades. And so on the one hand, my research looks at reasons why multinational corporations, for instance, relocate investments in developing economies. And then on the other hand, I look at the impact of such capital movements on the economic growth process of those host nations. So this paper, which I'm going to be talking about today, incorporates special dependency into the model for foreign direct investment in Africa. And there's a reason why we want to do that. I just want to talk briefly about the background. So when you're talking about the literature on economic growth, going back to 1956, when Robert Solow published that groundbreaking book, and then Swan 1956, so Solow growth model basically talks about how technology, which Solow regards as exogenous, sustain economic growth, long-run economic growth. And then, of course, in the late 80s and 90s, Paul Romer became a pioneer in the area of endogenous growth theory, trying to explain sources of technological advancement, which is always regarded as a main driver of productivity growth across countries. There's also Cole, Helpman, and Hofmeister, 1997. They argue that despite investing very little in research and development, developing economies such as economies in Africa, South America, and elsewhere do benefit from advanced economies through imports of intermediate goods to cheaply produce finished goods and services. Okay, so the literature has focused mainly over the past couple of decades on these foreign direct investment inflows. Has been identified as one of the main key elements contributing to productivity and economic growth in many developing countries. And it really is, because we all know that from globalization, when companies relocate investments to developing economies, not only do they bring investments or capital with them, but they also bring technology. And the key idea is that this technology could find its way spilling over to the local firms in those host nations that can help to enhance their productivity growth as well. So that's a channel why economists think that this FDI is a crucial element in propelling productivity growth in developing countries. But there's one thing I want to talk about it based on the 2019 United Nations Conference on Trade and Development Statistical Yearbook. Foreign direct investment flows to developing countries by 2018, I read a little bit just before COVID, amounted to about $7.6 billion, right? But when you look at the trajectory of these FDI inflows to different developing country regions, let's say you look at Eastern Europe, you look at South America, the Caribbean region, Central America, and Asia, the African economies, African countries have received the least amount of productivity of foreign direct investment flows, compared to any other developing country regions. And that kind of explains the lagging behind of productivity growth in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, compared to other developing country regions. Because if foreign direct investment is the main conduit where technology spills over, and we are not attracting the most FDI inflows, so you would expect that the continent would lag behind in that regard. Okay, so so the literature kind of divided it from the micro part of it and the macro aspects of it. At the micro level, economists who are talking about these technology transfers, they're looking at farm level data. They're looking at when an American company or some company in Western Europe relocate investment in, say, in Africa, they're looking at how that can affect, the technology is going to spill over to affect domestic farms in those host nations. Okay. And there's so many, the history of this goes back to like 1920, when Marshall and Marshall basically published a paper using surveys of US farms that revealed in the surveys that their technology had spilled over to developing nations. So there's a little background on that. At the macro level, because at the macro level, we want to look at it at the aggregate, at the aggregate economic level. The literature has mainly focused on examining reasons why multinational corporations relocate investments of developing countries on the one hand, and the effects of such capital investments on host nations' economic growth, okay, on yet another. So for instance, there's some work that I did in 2017. We published this work in 2017, where we argued that the risk which is associated with external macroeconomic imbalances, or what we call balance of payment crisis, could be a deterrent to foreign direct investment flows to developing countries in general. The idea here is that if a country is going through some balance of payment crisis, let's say current account crisis, or going through debt crisis, like we saw with Greece recently, the International Monetary Fund, which is regarded as the international lender of the last resort, typically intervene if a country is a member, as an SDR account with the IMF or a member of the IMF. They intervene to kind of provide some short-term financing and economic policy reforms to help the country recover from such types of shocks, okay? So in this paper, we argue that while, if a country is going through that economic shock already, that sends a negative signal that the country's macroeconomic fundamentals are not good. So that kind of companies don't want to invest in a country which is unstable. when the macroeconomic factors are not doing well. But on the other hand, when people see the IMF intervening, because when the IMF intervene, let's say they provide some short-term financing for a country going through some kind of debt crisis, they're going to mandate the country to carry out some economic reforms. So ex ante, foreign direct investment would argue that you would think that maybe in the long term, the trajectory of economic growth in those countries after adopting IMF reforms would look good. So there's these two mixed messages that when a country is going through external macroeconomic shocks and an IMF intervention follows, those are the two mixed signals that we're sending to foreign companies. So in this paper, we argue with that there should be some, for a foreign company to actually know that a country is going to recover when they adopt these policy reforms, there had to be some kind of threshold institutional level of development, which can actually make these reforms be successful so that the country can recover. So that's what we did a couple of years ago, but we're doing a lot more work here now. So, but we know that most of the literature has ignored, when we talk about spillover effects of foreign direct investment, we're looking at, it's more localized within the country, where foreign companies, say, going to South Africa, are spilling this technology to domestic farms. So there's a handful of papers I've talked about geographical spillover effects, spillovers across borders, right? For instance, let me give you one example here, because maybe some of you might be quite new in this field of special econometrics. Think about a country like North Korea. Okay, this is our region outside of Africa. A country like North Korea. Because of trade embargo sanctions between the United States and North Korea, American companies are not allowed to invest in North Korea. But because of the close proximity of North Korea to China, so many US companies invest in China. And there's a lot of cross-border, crossings between North Koreans and the Chinese people. So you'd expect that the American technology that exists in China, because US companies are in China, would spill over to North Korea, because through imitation, they can imitate and adapt and use US technology. So that's how geographical spillover effect could be something that we know, or what we call third-party effect, right? A handful of papers have talked about this whatever. One of them is Baltagi in 2007. Actually find that the third-party effect of the decision to invest in a country could actually be huge, and the impact of such investments on neighboring countries. Okay, so geographical proximity and interdependence between developing economies in each region are very important consideration for technology transfer embodied in the foreign direct investment. So as I said, the literature is mostly silent at modeling the spillover effects of FDI inflows on economic growth in a special regression framework. So there's need to suggest models that examine the effects of FDI on economic growth that explicitly account for such special dependence and diffusion between countries. When you look at countries on the African continent, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are so many things that we would think that that make interdependency between these countries. First of all, Africa has got several regional trading agreements, like trading blocs. We have the ECOWAS, which is the Economic Cooperation of West African States. We have the East African Community on the eastern part of Africa. We have the Common Market for East and South African countries, COMESA, and then we have the South African Development Corporation. So these regional blocs tend to kind of strengthen interdependency through international trade between these countries in different parts of Africa. And then the other thing that we think could make the case for this geographical spillover effect of foreign direct investment be felt across the African continent. There are several countries in Africa which are landlocked countries, okay? They don't have access to the sea when they're shipping their goods. They have to go through another country. Okay, so infrastructural development that cuts across countries, like, countries are sharing pipeline infrastructure. Countries that have oil, for example, they share pipeline infrastructure to transport oil from one country that is a landlocked to the sea, so that they can gain access to export these goods abroad, right, to foreign countries. Okay, so such kinds of interdependency can make this regional spillover effects even more important. So that puts a case why we should we should account for space-time dynamics when we model the impact of foreign direct investment on economic growth. Because not at the end of the day, not only one country is going to benefit. So think about it. If an investment goes to, like, say, I would say, let me pick one country here, like Kenya. Okay, let's say a lot of companies go and invest in Kenya. You would expect that that's going to be the economy, Uganda, maybe South Sudan, and maybe Ethiopia, because they're along that belt, the East African belt, they're all going to benefit from this investment. So the economic growth process of Kenya is not only going to be boosted, but that's going to generate these regional spillover effects that make the entire region better off, right? So this project attempts to answer the following key questions. Even though Baltagi and others have tried to incorporate special dependency models when they're looking at the impact of FDI flows to developing countries, many people have not looked at what the intermediary roles played by institutions, natural resource endowment, and things like conflict, things like international trade or trade openness. Okay, so what we're doing here, we not only are we trying to look at the space-time dynamics, looking at the spillover effects of this investment to other countries, we are actually accounting for the intermediary roles played by institutional quality, natural resource and endowment in different countries, conflict and stuff like that. Because I'll give you one, so the argument we are putting here is that for an FDI to have a greater spillover impact or direct effect on a country that's attracting that investment in the first place, you need to have good institutions that can help this investment make an impact. Okay, so we control for those in our model. So we pose a question like, how does size of foreign direct investment inflows to a country affect its economic growth directly, what we call the direct effect? And what would be the spillover effects, the spillover mechanisms of neighboring countries, like I talked about? And then what would be the intermediate role of trade, institutional environment, such as conflict, democracy, and in determining the causal impact of this FDI inflows to a country and neighboring countries' economic performance? And then we also argue that we want to investigate whether resource-endowed African countries suffer what we call in the literature the resource curse through different institutional environments. Because when you look, I'm going to share with you the data, and you look at the trends in foreign direct investment flows to sub-Saharan African region. Typically, when you look at the data, most of these foreign companies are investing heavily in countries that are rich in natural resources. In fact, when you look at the data, following a resource discovery in any country, you see a lot of foreign direct investment poured in that country. But could these countries tend to suffer some kind of resource curse because of this? When you concentrate investment in only a few sectors, like natural resource sectors of the economy, maybe perhaps some African countries could then ignore investment in other critical sectors of the economy, like the health sector, education, agriculture, and others. So maybe this could actually suffocate economic growth, because they're concentrating investment in only one or a few sectors that they have discovered new natural resource goods. Okay, and then let me share with you this trend, kind of the motivation here. When you look at the trends from the 1990s up to 2015, this is a trend of foreign direct investment flows to different sub-regions of Africa. The World Bank classifies Africa in different regions, 4 regions: Southern Africa, Western African countries, Central African countries, and Eastern African countries. So you can see that when you look at the trend there, the South African countries and the West African countries dominate in attracting foreign direct investment, especially in the 2010. You can see the green line and the black line jumped up. The green line, those are investment flows to West African countries, and the black line basically showing the trajectory or the trends of foreign FDI flows to Southern African countries. Central and Eastern African countries have attracted the least FDIs. So even within sub-Saharan Africa itself, there are regional differences. There's heterogeneity across regions, sub-regions of Africa. Okay, so these numbers are, by the way, they're in millions of US dollars. So when I say $5,000 there, that is $5 billion US dollars worth of foreign direct investment flows to those sub-regions of Africa. 10,000 would be 10 billion. Okay, so that's what it is. Okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier, a little bit earlier. So this picture that you're seeing here basically showing you trends in foreign direct inflows following a resource discovery. Okay, so let's look at Mozambique. Okay, one of the largest natural gas discovery was made in Mozambique in 2006 by an American company called Andaco. So after 2006, look at how foreign investments went up in Mozambique. That's like a big jump because countries that, send investment capital to go and try to extract these natural resources. Same place for Equatorial Guinea, in the mid-2000s, they discovered huge deposits of oil. Then look at places like Ghana, Uganda, following like discovery of oil, Ethiopia. So you see, every time a country discovers some natural resource good, we see a jump in the FDI flows to those countries. That means many of these foreign companies, when they go to Africa, they're more interested in natural resource sectors, natural resource goods. They're not investing evenly in other sectors of the economy. So that's why we're saying that it's very important to control for the intermediary role played by natural resource endowment in estimating the impact of foreign direct investment on the economic growth of those countries. Because if there's a Dutch disease proposition that we can put here, the Dutch disease, for non-economists here, in the 1940s, the government of the Netherlands concentrated investment in its oil and gas industry, expecting that sector would create employment and boost economic growth overall for the economy of the Netherlands. But it turned out to be true. When they heavily invested in oil and gas, they drew resources away. So there was some kind of negative externality imposed on the other sectors of the Dutch economy. So overall, employment actually went down. Okay, so when you hear economists talking about the Dutch disease, they're basically referring, we're not talking about any pandemic here, another pandemic in the Netherlands. They're talking about how concentration of resources in oil and gas in the Netherlands ended up affecting the overall economy. And that's why we want to try to estimate this for Africa. Are these concentrating resource in investment in one or a few natural resource industries affect the economic growth overall? That's what we want to find out. Okay, so before I talked about the model part of it, because we may not get a lot of time, because if you may bear with me, if you have any question, I would argue that you probably want to ask me towards the end of my presentation, because sometimes it kind of, it messes up the flow of the presentation. But if there's something that you feel like you're happy about, you want me to clarify, I would be happy to do that. So here's a summary of our key findings before I start talking about the modeling, because I want this to come and stick to your mind what we find in this paper. So when you look at the data for macroeconomic data for African region before 2000, the data quality is not good. It's so disjointed. So before 2000, we find the FDI impact on countries' economic growth to be statistically insignificant. However, after 2000, when the data quality improved, we find that the direct effects of foreign direct investment flows on economic growth are positive and persistent, while indirect effects have the same sign as direct effects, but have weaker statistical significance after the 2000s. But for each interaction variable, we also show whether they have reinforcing or what we call antagonistic impact of FDI on economic growth. I'll give you one example, for instance. We are finding out that if foreign investments, say, move to a country in Africa, and let's say that country is also involved in some civil conflict, it could be also intrastate or interstate conflict, then the impact of foreign direct investment on economic growth of that country is going to be muted. So you're not going to get a full-blown, because they're fighting wars, civil wars, right? So that's why we want to find how so that means the impact of foreign direct investment, that variable, which is conflict, is going to have an antagonistic impact in its intermediary role when foreign companies invest in such an economy. And then in general, we find that the overall trade openness is a reinforcing variable on the effect of foreign direct investment on growth. However, we do not find any significant intermediary role that within Africa trade openness plays in enhancing the FDI impact on growth. And this should not be surprising to anybody. Okay, when we look at the trade openness as a whole, and we look at different measures of trade openness. We look at the volume of trade as a share of GDP. That's how economies measure how open your economy is, or the share of exports to GDP. We also look at import tariffs, because that can restrict how countries trade among each other. Imports tariff as a share of GDP, tariff revenue from taxing imports. As a share of the economy, we look at primary product exports, how that, affect, play a role in there. But what we find is that trade among African countries don't play any significant intermediary role of the impact of FDI on growth, because trade among African countries is still very small. But the overall trade openness for, let's say, an African country with the rest of the world has an impact. And then we also find that the political stability is a key factor for inward FDI, and is positively correlated with regional economic growth in African countries. So it has both direct and spillover effects to other countries within the region. Okay. The good news is that after 2000, most of Africa is generally stable now. When you look at it, you go back to post-independence days of the 1960s and the 70s and the 80s, when several countries were fighting civil conflicts or some interstate wars between countries, then the impact of civil conflict on economic growth used to be really huge, used to be big, right? But still, you can't discount a few pockets of conflicts in Africa, like, in the Democratic Republic of Congo region, South Sudanese conflict, and the Boko Haram, those regions bordering Cameroon and Nigeria. So we still have these pockets of conflict. You can still quantify the impact of those smaller units of conflict that exist in Africa today on economic growth, and how that can mute the impact of foreign direct investment flows on economic growth. And then we find that while exploiting natural resources does not necessarily cause natural resources costs directly, it lessens the FDI impact on regional economic growth. So there's going to be, that spillover effect is going to be a lot less, if there's a big natural resource in a country like, say, Uganda, they discovered oil, or like, say, Ghana has discovered oil, Mozambique discovering natural gas, so it is going to affect neighboring countries' economic growth. It mutes the impact of FDI spillover to neighboring countries. And then one of the most interesting ones that we found, people have always thought that promoting democracy is a good thing for Africa, which is good. I strongly believe in democratization of the African continent, right? But what we find in this, we don't find a linear relationship. So we find that the relationship of the intermediary role played by democracy in enhancing the FDI impact on growth is non-linear. So in other words, what I mean by that, countries which are in Africa, which are highly democratic, okay, the impact of FDI tend to be highest. But we find that, countries with moderate democratic structure perform worse than those that are more autocratic. So that means movement from autocratic regimes to moderate democratic regimes could actually affect the impact of foreign direct investment on economic growth. It could mute the impact of FDI flows on economic growth. Okay, and we know this is kind of where there's a lot of research. I know Asimoglu has talked about. He finds something similar to what we're talking about, but he's using a non-special model. He's arguing that sometimes moving from a totally autocratic regime to a more moderate regime, can bring instability in a country. We all saw what happened in Libya following the death of Gaddafi, right? Then Libya was left with a mess, so destabilized Libya. Libya used to be a little bit, even though it's a completely autocrat that ruled Libya, but the economy used to be a lot more stable, compared to what it is now. So that probably demonstrates what I'm saying here, that when you're moving from a purely autocratic system to trying to attain upper level democracy, it's a little bit murky. It's not a smooth transition. So we find that, that transition also can affect the overall impact of FDI in economic growth. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about the model that we're going to be using here. We are going to be using the special dependence model. So in special econometrics literature, there's a wide variety of alternative model specifications that include various combinations of special dependence, various combinations of special dependence, And in addition, the uncertainty on the weights matrix structure escalates the challenge of selecting the appropriate specification. So we have in the sample, we have 43 out of the 55 African countries in our sample for this work, because some countries don't have data. So what are you going to do about that? So we were able to get consistent data on 43 out of the 55 countries. So what you gotta know is that first of all, we're going to show you that if we don't account for trade openness here, things kind of fall apart. I just want to make that very clear. But because there are several model specifications in special econometrics, the choice of a specific model, you have to be careful in choosing which model you're using for estimating, your data, fitting your data. Okay. So model choice can be based on the subjective theoretical motivations or objective statistical tests. So here we use some kind of Bayesian technique to identify which model is appropriate for our data, for the data generation process that we're looking here for the African economies. So the thing is, theoretically, when you think about it, the mobility of factors of production across countries are a lot more restrictive. Like, factors of production like labor capital, say within Africa, there's no free mobility. There's some restrictions. Then when you're looking at it in sub-national level. So that tells us that perhaps maybe the specially large explanatory variable model, that SLX would be an appropriate model that we should be using here, but we need to carry out some tests. So we have the SDM here, which is the special Dubbin model. And then you have a more sophisticated special model, which is a special Dubbin error model. And then you have the SLS model. So thankfully, when I joined this university, I was able to be mentored by one of the best special econometricians in the country. His name was Jim Lesage, so he's a special. So Jim has done a lot of work. Like in 2004, Jim published a paper in special econometrics and arguing that unless the special or regressive or special error model are identified in theory, the only relevant special specification are those ones that I've listed there. Special Dubbin model and a special Dubbin error model and specially large explanatory variable model. So, and then what happens here is that when we're using Bayesian here, because the special log model that we finally zeroed in is a local spillover model, okay? Basically means that the spillover effect from country A would spill over to country B in a linear format, right? So we are not using the global spillover model, okay? Which would, like the SDEM and others, right? We're using basically a local spillover model. So global basically means that an economic shock could globally impact countries like randomly, right? Like you think about like a pandemic, when we have like COVID-19, when the way it transmits itself, that could be a global spillover effect because people are taking, somebody takes a flight from one location and goes maybe to another country or another state. We are looking at the United States. So that would be like more like a global spillover effect. In our case, we're talking about a local spillover effect. So let's say the spillover will move from, say, Uganda, in a linear format, let's say it's spill over to, let's say, South Sudan, maybe it's spill over from South Sudan to Sudan. Okay, and then we also need to test for the neighborhood, how your neighbor's economic shock will affect you, right? Because certainly you know that in a space-time dynamic, if you have an economic shock happening in Kenya, you're not going to expect the impact to be going to Uganda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and you still expect that the impact the geographical impact to be stronger as you move north to North African countries. Okay, there's going to be some diffusion, so by the time you reach countries which are more distant from you, the impact of that shock would have dissipated in space. Okay, so we're looking at the diffusion of this foreign direct investment impact on growth, both in space and through time. So there's also a time dynamics here. We're going to use like as a dynamics special lag explanatory model. So this Bayesian test that you're talking about here. So the first table you're seeing, table 1A, is when we are looking at, we want to look at which neighborhood, where should you stop? So we pick the first 3 neighborhoods, right? Like neighborhood countries. And that guides how we create our weights matrix, our inverse distance weights matrix, which we use for capturing the special effect. So you can see that according to that table, basically show the first table on top, basically, if we don't include index of trade openness, it says that you probably want to have the 3 nearest neighbors. That's when the impact of this spillover is going to be felt more. Because as you go to the 4th country, the 5th country, you can see that the marginal likelihood, the marginal likelihood, probability distribution from that marginal likelihood function kind of dissipate. You don't get any impact at all. Okay, but once we include the trade openness in the model, which is table 1B, you can see that the model probability, marginal probability here, basically, the SLX and the SDM are almost identical. Okay, and then based on that 2014 paper by Jim, that theoretical paper, they argue that this is a case where you would choose the the SLX model would be more appropriate in the estimation. So if you want more of this, we can talk about more during the discussion session. Okay, so we are interested in the persistent effects of macroeconomic dynamics. So we use both static LSX and then we use the dynamic, because you have to look for time dynamics here, because you expect the effect of a shock, an economic shock, not to affect the country in only one time period. That impact can impact the economy through time. It may be, could be persistent. Maybe even after 5 years, the impact is still on economic growth. So, and then we're going to use the cumulative long-run response functions, impulse response functions, to kind of quantify the persistence of these shocks. So when, let's say, if the economy of South Africa attracts more FDI in 2022, we want to look at how that is going to affect the economy of South Africa in 2022, 2023, 2024, and how that shock dissipates, the impact of that shock dissipates over time. Maybe after 5 years, it depends on how persistent it is. The impact is gonna disappear. Okay, of that one shock. Okay, and then we also do the same thing on what? On the spillover effects of that what? Of that shock over time and through space. Okay. So we're going, and then as I said, we apply interaction terms, and we did some kind of theoretical analysis, theoretical derivations of how we incorporate these intermediary variables into our special dependency model, into our specially lag explanatory model here. Because we had, as I said earlier on, we are saying that the impact of foreign direct investment on economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa is going to be felt depending on what? On some of these intermediary factors, like whether you have democracy, whether you're fighting a civil conflict, whether you have a lot of natural resource endowment, those kind of stuff. Okay, so if you incorporate those intermediary or intermediation variables, right? Like trade openness, like democracy, index of conflict, you need to find out how the partial derivatives from your SLX model is going to look like. Okay, it takes a couple of steps to derive these partial derivatives. Okay, so I want to talk about the data. The data set covers 43 sub-Saharan African countries over the period 1990 to 2016. However, our analysis focuses mainly from period 2000 to 2016 for the obvious reason that I told you, that the data quality in African countries prior to 2000, data quality is is not good, you know what I mean? So data is very disjointed, you don't get consistent data in some countries. So here are the summary statistics, the mean standard deviation of the variables that we use. Of course, when you're estimating the impact of foreign direct investment on growth, there are standard control variables that you need to have. You need to control for the size of the economy, so we use GDP per capita to control for the size of the market. We control for macroeconomic stability, like we use the index of inflation. You can see that we have that trade openness. We look at share of government spending to GDP. We control for conflict. We have our index of index that is capturing how endowed a country is in natural resources. So we use natural resource rents as a share of the economy. Okay, and then we also broke it down. Not only did we use the absolute value of natural resource rents in the data on natural resources, we also broke it down into different types of natural resource goods. Like we look at oil rents, like coal rents, forest rents. Africa is endowed in forests, like tropical forests. So people are extracting like timber, like mahogany wood from Africa, so it's a big deal. It's a big one of the biggest natural resource goods that foreign direct investments are actually exploiting on the African continent. Okay. And then the other thing that anytime you do research on estimating the impact of foreign direct investment on the economy, on economic growth, there's always this big econometric catch, what we call the big E, endogeneity, okay, and or simultaneity, right? So endogenity's idea is that maybe foreign direct investment could impact economic growth, but economic growth can also can have a feedback loop to affect foreign direct investment. So you need to test whether you don't have any endogeneity concern in your model. Otherwise, you're going to end up with bias and inconsistent estimates, okay? So we basically use the Granger causality test to test whether the causality runs from foreign direct investment to economic growth, or it runs from growth to what? To backwards to FDI, okay? But so when we did this test in our panel data framework, we actually found that most of the causality is running from foreign direct investment to economic growth. There's little statistical evidence to suggest that the correlation is running from, or the causality is running from growth to FDI. Okay, so that tells us that the endogeneity concern is not we don't have an endogeneity concern here. Okay. Okay. So now let's look at our baseline specification here. It's kind of a long thing because the equation is long because when you're doing the specially explanatory special model, you're looking at, it's not a standard econometric technique where if you're looking at the impact of inflation on economic growth of a country, you just look at that. Here, you need to put a special term, right? You have to put a weights matrix or a special dependency term on each of our explanatory variables. So you see these WIJ terms, on inflation, on FDI, trade openness, government spending. So this is just our baseline model, okay? And then you can see our epsilon there is going to be just our error term, which is basically IIDs, independent and identically distributed with mean 0 and standard deviation sigma. And then we have our, unobserved, like time invariant variables that might be specific to a country. That is going to be that eta I, and then you got that delta T, which is basically going to be the time specific factors, right? Okay, variables that are specific to a country that vary through time. Okay, so here is going to be our baseline result. Okay, and this is when we use the data from 2000.
I guess Eylem has a question.
Go ahead.
Hello. So I have a quick question about endogeneity.
Hey, go ahead.
Okay, you said simultaneity is not a big problem. It's not a big deal. But
no, I was talking about endogeneity in particular. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, but endogeneity may result from the omitted variable bias, right?
Yeah, he could, yes.
So, but you control for time constant variables, but time invariant. I'm sorry, yes, time variable unobserved factors may affect your results, right?
Yeah.
Am I right? Can you go back to the slides, the equation, please?
You mean this? This is okay.
Yes. Here, because you control for country fix effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me put on my eyeglasses. Okay. But the error term, yes, time varying unobserved factors is there. it might be correlated with FDI, right?
Yes, yeah, but not in a natural setting, in a panel data format, you need to control for these time, these unobserved time invariant factors.
Yeah. It's okay, but
to some
time
extent,
varying unobserved factors may be correlated with FDI. What I'm trying to say.
Yeah. It could. So
it may cause the endogeneity problem. Then.
And we make mention of that, why our Granger causality test could be a relatively weaker test, but at least to some extent, it gives you an idea.
With Granger causality, you can rule out the simultaneity, right?
Absolutely, I understand what you're talking about. Yeah.
You got my point?
Yeah, the methodology we're using here allows you to test for, the direction of that causality, whether it's going from FDI to economic growth, or is going from growth to FDI. So when you look at the test, this table here, the causality actually is moving mostly from FDI to economic growth rather than backwards. We make a note about the impact of time invariant, country specific factors which are time invariant, that header, which could cause additional causality backwards to affect FDI. That's right.
But let me clarify my point. So my point is not time invariant unobserved factors, time varying unobserved factors.
You're talking about time varying, okay.
Okay.
Which is the way, yeah.
So just to make it clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Then the one thing that you also notice here is that, which we discuss in the paper, is, we log all our exogenous variables, right? Because the idea here is that the impact of an economic shock at time t may not contemporaneously affect growth in that particular time period, right? So we put some
that's good. That's okay. The variables do not appear, right? In your regression may create a problem, right?
Yeah, you're talking about the media. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, of course.
You got my point?
I would, and that's the reason why we have the error term. In a regression, there's almost no specification where you're going to have an exact measure that you're going to have all the variables on the right.
No, of course, you cannot control for everything.
You cannot do that, even if you're using instrument. I know,
but if you claim that, so you establish causality, so I think you should mention that, right?
Yeah, there's a discussion in the paper where we actually have a whole section we discuss those issues there.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, but that's a good observation. I take note of what you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The impact of that, country specific time varying variable delta t could impose some causality backwards to affect to FDI.
Sorry for interrupting you because I should leave early, so that's why I just.
Okay, no, that's fine. You can ask any question. You can interrupt me anytime. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So let me get through the results first. And for a lot of people here, who some of you may not be do this type of work, the big E is one of the most important challenges in doing this type of estimation, endogeneity. We call it the big E in econometrics. And if you're trying to use like instruments, the choice of an appropriate instrument that can control for endogeneity bias is always a big challenge in empirical work. Yeah. But as a statistician, you try to do the best to make sure that you minimize the feedback loop from your dependent variable back to your exogenous variables. So that's the point she was raising. So anyway, so what we did, we first in our baseline estimates, we broke our data from 1990 to 1999, 2000, 2009, 2000, 2016, because we want to look at like the decade impact of FDI inflows on growth in the 90s and the 2000 and the 2010s and stuff like that. And you can see that before 2000, you can see, as I said, the data quality was very poor for these African countries. You can see that we didn't get any statistically significant impact of foreign direct investment. Both the indirect and direct effect were relatively insignificant. But after 2000, you can see both the direct effect and the indirect effect of FDI flows to on economic growth became statistically significant, at least at a 99% confidence level. And then now what we do here is that we want to find out how persistent as these shocks. As I say, there's a time dynamics in our model, and then we're doing the space-time dynamics, because if you have an FDI flows to a country, it takes time for the impact of that shock impacting economic growth to dissipate. It might take 5 years. So we want to look at how persistent are these shocks on economic growth. So you can see, so this is more like the cumulative response, cumulative marginal impulse response function in a special dependency framework. So here we're looking at how the impact of the direct effect of FDI on growth on the country that attracts that investment itself. So you can see after this second year, after year 3, year 4, the impact has dissipated. And we also find that the indirect effect doesn't last long. In fact, after the first period, we don't find any significant, any persistence of how that spillover is going to affect countries in the neighborhood. And so now we start to incorporate some of these intermediary interaction terms that we're talking about. Because we're saying that the impact of foreign direct investment on economic growth perhaps is going to be maximized or is going to be more enhancing on growth if a country is more open to international trade. So for countries that trade a lot with their neighbors or trade a lot with the rest of the world, you'd expect the impact of foreign direct. And there's a huge literature, both theoretical and empirical literature, that looks at substitutability and complementarity of foreign direct investment, trade openness nexus. So we try to test that type of intermediary effect of foreign. So here you see our last term there. We're interacting FDI and trade openness, index of trade openness. And then later I'm going to show you, not only do we look at the overall index of trade openness, which is a share of volume of trade or exports as a share of the economy. We look at different other measures of trade openness that include, let's say, taxes on imports as a share of GDP. We look at things like primary exports as a share of GDP, because African countries typically export primary products, raw material goods, So the results for this interaction here, this is now data for after 2000. You can see that, first of all, overall trade openness is the direct impact is positive and significant. You see that, but we didn't find any indirect impact. So that's so trade openness on its own positively affect economic growth. But when we interact now, that trade openness with FDI, see that FDI times trade, we see that both the direct and the indirect effects are all statistically positive and statistically significant. Meaning that maybe trade openness is a mechanism through which foreign direct investment can impact a country's economic growth. So this is a message from a policy point of view. Countries that tend to restrict international trade, may not feel the full benefit of the impact of foreign capital in their economy. And not only will they don't feel the full benefit, the spillover effect of that capital flow may not affect neighboring countries as well. So you want countries to be open if they want to maximize. Okay, so this is a suggestion perhaps that foreign direct investment and trade openness are complementary. They are not substituted. They are not substitutable variables in the regression, because they are positive. The interaction time is positive. And then we also show, what about within Africa trade openness, like trade among African countries? Remember, this is like a 43 by 43 matrix here. So we're looking at, so we find that African countries trade very little among themselves, That's why perhaps you see that the impact, the intermediate role of within African trade openness is statistically insignificant for the most part. Both the direct, indirect, and total effects are insignificant statistically. Okay, and then what we do, we break down different types of, in this part, we also look at the extent of that trade openness we break out our data sample. We look at countries whose trade openness is between 0 to 25%. That means that countries that are trading 25% of their GDP or below, and countries that are trading below between 25 to 50% of their GDP. Right? That's about 21% of our sample. And then African countries that are trading between 50 to 75% of their GDP, or 33% of the sample. So you can see. So we put them in group in that percentile. So you can see that as trade openness increases, right? As the index of trade openness increases, so is the statistical significance and the economic significance of the impact of foreign direct investment on growth. So that tells you that the more you open your borders and trade with the rest of the world, that's how you're going to maximize the impact of FDI on economic growth. Okay, so we look at different levels of trade openness as well. And then we break down, we also look at here in terms of different measures of trade openness. Okay, we're not only looking at the share of total volume of trade in a country to GDP, we're looking at it in terms of like tax on exports, for instance. There are countries that tax their exports. I know in the United States, the US laws prevent American government from taxing exports of US companies going to the rest of the world, but we tax imports, of course. But in African countries, there are countries that tax exports. When goods are leaving the country, going out, they can levy taxes on those taxes on exports. Then we also look at change in exports, which is another measure that economists use as an index of trade openness. And then we look at primary exports of primary goods as a share of GDP. So you can see it's clear from those regression that the interaction term between trade openness, and these different measures of trade openness, right? With different measures, you can see, look at for primary products, for instance, the direct effect is negative and significant. So basically, the idea here is that if your country is only engaged in exporting primary goods, commodities, right? That actually mutes the impact of what? Of foreign direct investment on economic growth of your country. So no matter how much capital you attract in the economy, if you continue to you don't add value to your exports, then the impact of that FDI inflow on growth is going to be muted. It's going to be downgraded. That's why you see that intermediary term is negative, showing that for primary exports, that's not a good thing. But when you look at change in exports, when you increase your export, that generally is beneficial and maximizing the impact of foreign direct investment. The middle columns, you see that it is statistically significant at the 1%, or a 99% confidence band, and a 95% for indirect effect, respectively. Okay. Then the other thing that we control for us, our intermediary variable, is conflict. Okay, I should have presented all this in one table, but the table gets really big. That's why I chopped it in different, whatever. So we're looking at how conflict affect the impact of foreign direct investment on economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see that the first column is when I don't have the interaction term. So I basically look at how the conflict by itself directly impact economic growth in Africa. And the second column is is going to be the indirect effect of that conflict, neighboring countries' economic growth. So you see, it's negative because this obvious reason, conflict always negatively impact economic growth. Several researchers, including Collier, have done work on this. They found that conflict is bad for economic growth. But now, when we interact FDI and economic growth, which is basically the last three columns, the results of the last three columns of that table, you can see that when a country is fighting civil conflict and attracting foreign capital, that impedes the impact of that foreign capital on economic growth. The impact is going to be less than when you're out of conflict. So, and both the direct and indirect spillover, regionally, it not only affects even your own economy, but it affects it negatively impedes the spillover effect of that foreign direct investment on regional economic growth. So let me give you an example. If let's say South Sudan is fighting a civil conflict, and they attract some foreign capital, the impact, not only the impact of that foreign capital on South Sudanese economic growth is going to be muted, but it also is going to impede the spillover effect to neighboring countries' economic growth. The countries that neighbor South Sudan, like main Sudan, Uganda, might also might have a negative effect on their growth, spillover effect. That's what that means. Okay. And then also what we look at, as I said before, most African countries are no longer fighting civil conflict like we used to see in the 1967s and 80s. So maybe looking at this at a different level of conflict, okay? So if we look stratified, could look different levels, so conflict zero means country has not experienced any conflict. One means your conflict, at least one civil conflict in your country. And we tested data using both interstate and intrastate conflict, right? So you can see, but you know, see, as I said, most of the African countries are no longer in conflict. You can see this last table is a little bit biased because 79.79% of our sample means zero conflict, okay? Then at least 6.84% of our already 43 countries in Africa, well, at least we recorded one conflict in the economy. And you can see the number disappears quickly, meaning that we are no longer, the intensity of civil conflict in Africa has gone down significantly in contemporary times, especially after the 2000s. So there's more stability in Africa, okay? So, as you can see, even though our data is a little bit going to be biased because there's not going to be a lot of countries left in the sample as you increase civil conflict, you can see that the direct effect becomes more and more, the coefficient becomes more and more negative and statistically significant as you vary the size of conflict in the economy. So a country that's fighting might be fighting 3 different types of conflict. Because I remember, I'll give you a case like a case of Uganda. There was a time in Uganda they were fighting the civil conflict in northern Uganda, and they're also fighting civil conflict in the in the western part of Uganda, which borders the Congo, because they had rebel activities coming from the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's possible that a country can have multiple conflicts from different regions of the country, but as I say, as you have more conflict, the intensity of that conflict also rises. So is the negative impact of the FDI on economic growth, because you can do that. So that shows up in our sample. Okay, and then this is one of the things I want to talk about: natural resources. We control for natural resource rents, because the idea is that when you look at our sample there, or the trajectory, as I talked about at the beginning, of a foreign direct investment to African economies, even in the 90s, the 2000s, and more recent times, most of those FDIs are going into exploiting natural resources. That they go into natural resource sectors of the economy. So we want to test whether there's any resource cuts on the countries that attract this foreign capital to exploit their natural resources. Okay. Okay. So you can see that natural resources by itself, there's some natural resource cuts already, direct effect. That's many economists have found that countries that have a lot of natural resources may not necessarily have experienced high economic growth. In fact, growth could actually be repressed. And you see that. And we've seen that countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa with very vast amount of natural resources, sometimes they experience negative economic growth. So you see that the direct effect of an FDI flow of natural resource is negative. But when you look at overall in all the specifications that I've been showing you, your foreign direct investment is always positive and significant. So it has a positive impact on economic growth. Okay. Okay. Now, when we interact foreign direct investment with resource rent, so resource rent, basically, we're taking a total natural resource rents as a share of the economy. Okay. If we interact that with the FDI, we're looking at the intermediary effect of natural resource endowment on the impact of foreign direct investment on growth. That's what that means. That's how you interpret the last 3 columns, which you have your direct, indirect, and total effect estimates. So you can see that countries that are relatively well endowed with natural resources, the impact of that FDI flows on economic growth tend to go down, the direct effect. But we don't find evidence to suggest that the spillover effect, there's no statistical evidence, you see, it's not significant for the spillover effect from that intermediary role played by natural resources on economic growth, okay? And then what we do too, we also go ahead and say, okay, we can't just look at natural resources as a whole. We can break down natural resources into subgroups like coal, coal rents. We can talk about oil rents, countries that are, companies that are going to exploit oil in Africa. We can also talk about things like forests. There are so many companies in Africa that are exploiting getting mahogany wood in the Congo, for instance, and some, in Uganda, and there's so many companies down there. Okay, so let's break that down. But before I break it down, let's first look at it in terms of the degree of endowment of natural resources. Okay, so when I say, so countries whose natural resource rents as a share of GDP range between 0 to 5%, those are 26.6% in our sample of the 43 countries that we look in sub-Saharan Africa. And then countries whose resource rents range between 5 to 15%, they're about 41 to 57% in the sample. Resource rents between 15 to 25%, about 20.94% of the sample, and resource rents above 25 but below 35. So you can see it goes down. Countries which is over 55% of the natural resource rent is 0.073% of the sample. But what you see here is that there's something interesting here. So this is telling you now that look at the direct estimate and indirect effect estimates there. They are positive and significant for countries that have what? That are less endowed with natural resources. So what does that tell you? That is telling you that what? Countries that don't have a lot of natural resources, anytime they attract foreign direct investment, the impact of that foreign direct investment is a lot felt on their economic growth, their own economic growth, more than when you have more natural resources. Perhaps this is the argument that maybe the foreign direct investment in those such types of economies without a lot of natural resource endowment tend to be evenly dispersed across different sectors of the economy. So the country doesn't suffer this disease problem that I was talking about earlier on, because you don't have natural resources. So we're going to have resources spread across all sectors of the economy. And you can see that's also true for the spillover effect. And as you move down that table, that meaning that the more natural resource endowment you have in a country, the less is the impact of foreign direct investment on your economic growth. Because this is true, because I talked about this. You've seen in the table that I showed you, the graph that I showed you earlier on. Every time a country in sub-Saharan Africa discovers some natural resource good, there's an immediate influx of foreign investment in that particular sector. So maybe resources tend to get drawn away from the other significant sectors of the African economies to actually mute the overall impact on economic growth. So this is actually a very interesting finding. It tells a very interesting story about how natural resource goods. There are some economists who published a paper recently in the Review of Economics and Statistics for Africa. They actually argue that the impact of natural resource rents on economic growth overall could affect. They do in the short and the long run. It could impact economic growth in Africa by a large proportion in the short run. In the long run, the impact would even be a lot worse. Okay. All right. And so here's where we look at different types of natural resources. So you see, I had the first two columns that I have for all direct and indirect effect on oil rents. Then I have coal rents and forest rents, because those are the ones we could get consistent data on. And then, but what I'm more interested in, you can see. So we find that the direct impact of foreign direct investment, countries investing in oil, that just the direct effect of FDI is going to be positive. Okay, but what if I get the interaction between FDI and what? And oil rent. See, when I say FDI and natural resources there, because the first two columns are oil rents, that have interacted the FDI with oil rents as a share of GDP, you can see that becomes negative. That means even though FDI on its own could positively impact economic growth for African countries, when you interact that FDI with natural oil rents, for instance, then the impact of that FDI on economic growth is going to get muted. Okay, and there are a lot of there's some recent studies which these economists did study in Nigeria, looking at. So Nigeria has been one of the fourth largest crude oil exporter to the United States since the 1960s. Okay? It's a big deal, for the Nigerian economy. And they argue that, with all the oil money that's flown to the Nigerian economy, still, the impact on economic growth is still not felt like the way you'd expect, So there's this natural resource cost, which is true in Africa, in the natural resource sectors of the economy. The one thing that we did not include in this paper, which we want to explore more, we also want to introduce some elements of a good institutional variable, which is corruption. we are actually extending this paper right now, not only for Africa. We are looking at all developing country regions to see whether these spillover mechanisms that we found in the sub-Saharan African region, whether it's true for all other developing country regions, let's say South America, Central America, the Caribbean region, Asian region, the Eastern European region. Do these results all up across different developing country regions? That's what we're working on currently right now. So we have data for the rest of the other developing country regions. Okay, so when we look at call rents, we don't find any statistically significant intermediary role of call rents on economic growth. Maybe call is dead everywhere. You know, call is dead in America. Maybe it's dead in Africa. But anyway, it's a joke. But that's what it is. And in forest rent, we also don't find any significant intermediary effect on forest rent. Okay. And then the last thing that we controlled for was democracy. Okay, remember we're saying that as one of the institutional variables. Okay, we want to test whether countries which are autocratic, the autocratic regimes, do they do better when they attract foreign capital? Does the impact of foreign direct investment get maximized in a country with a dictator or an autocratic regime versus a country which is embracing democracy, which is a highly democratic? But as I said in my earlier summary of findings, the impact here is a non-linear relationship. We find that, you know, at very low level of what, see, when I say democracy, autocratic regime here, then I put I interact FDA and democracy, autocratic regime, we find that democratic regimes tend to have positive impact on economic growth overall. But once we look at FDA and democracy or autocracy index, there's an index of democratic or autocratic index. So it ranges from 1 to 10. 1, if you're rank 1, that means you have you're autocratic. If you're 10, that means you're more democratic. Okay. Okay. But what we do, we also look at moderate. Okay. We test whether there's some kind of non-linearity. Countries that are moving from purely autocratic regimes they're brutal dictators to some elements of democracy, like moderate democracy, and from moderate democracy to high democracy. So you find that, I see, when I say low democracy versus moderate democracy, you see that the impact is positive, but when you go to, if you go down the list, you find that high democracy and low democracy, let's say you're moving backwards, you know, that we don't find any significant effect, right? And then what we found the most here, the most important, you know, message you get from this result for democracy is that if you're moving from autocratic regime to moderate democratic regime, that might not be good for amplifying the impact of FDI on economic growth. But if you're already a highly democratic regime in Africa, that is actually good for growth. In other words, moderate democracy, moving from autocratic to moderate democracy, you know, mutes the impact of FDI on economic growth than when you are actually an autocrat. You know what I mean? So that means it's not a linear relationship that you're moving from autocratic regimes to moderate to high democratic regimes that the impact of FDI is going to increase like that. No, you know, it depends on that democratic regime that you are in. If you're already at high level of democracy, then the economy is already stable, then that is good. Because there are studies that have been done recently that actually show that some autocratic regimes actually bring stability in a country. Think about, let me give you an example. Countries that are really brutal dictators. Think about like the former, like when Mubarak was the president of Egypt. You know, Egypt was stable for a long period of time. You know, they bring stability because they're brutal. You don't mess with them. You know, people like Gaddafi of Libya. You know, so maybe that autocratic, highly autocratic regimes can. So if you go and try to break it up, that like what we did, like what happened in Libya, right? You want to break that autocratic regimes immediately. Then you bring chaos in a country. Then, you know, then the impact of the foreign direct investment on economic growth may not be felt as much when you're trying to transition from that stable autocratic regime to a more moderate democratic regime. So this is what this is about. Okay, so it's not a linear relationship. So I just want to talk a few stuff on my concluding remarks here. So we have examined the effects, special effects of foreign direct investment inflows on economic growth in sub-Saharan African countries for a period 1990 to 2016. We used the Granger causality test to basically show that there's no endogeneity problem, so that the foreign direct investment measure is a plausible exogenous process in impacting economic growth in Africa. So there's not a lot of feedback loop going from growth to FDI, but mostly from FDI to growth, which is something we want to do in this type of empirical exercise. And then we employ special dependent specification, both in static and dynamic setting through our analysis. Special dependent specification estimate both direct and indirect the spillover effects, which is lacking in this type of research of FDI inflow, which is necessary in an environment where factors of production are mobile across borders. And then we use a Bayesian approach of model selection. So we use the Bayesian, the marginal probabilities to compare different model specification to actually figure out which model was suitable. And we found that a local spillover model, which was that specially lag exogenous variable model, was a more appropriate specification given our data sample. So that SLX model was basically, was the best model that would describe the data generating process for the data we have for the African economies. So as I said, before 2000, the foreign direct investment impact on the country's economic growth is insignificant. However, after 2000, we find that the direct effects were, they tend to be positive and persistent, while indirect effects had the same side, but had weaker statistical significance and did not have a lot of longevity on growth in terms of its persistence. So while we find significant spillover effects of foreign direct investment on economic growth, we also find that in terms of persistence, that spillover effect doesn't last for a long period of time. So the whole idea that when Kenya is hit by FDI, the impact is going to spill over to Uganda. That spillover is not going to last for a long time compared to the on-country's effect, the direct effect on the Kenyan economy itself. And then the political stability is a key factor for inward FDI and is positively correlated with regional economic growth in African countries. While exploiting natural resources does not necessarily cause natural resource cuts directly, it lessens the FDI impact on regional economic growth. And then also promoting democracy does not necessarily enhance the FDI impact on economic growth. Okay, we find that while FDI inflows promote economic growth, the most for counties with high democratic structure, the counties with moderate democratic structure perform worse than those that are more autocratic, suggesting that perhaps the impact of democracy is not a linear relationship. It's not a linear correlation with growth when you interact with FDI. I think that is what I want to say today. I would be glad to take some questions right now. And keep in mind, this paper is already, actually I feel so bad that this paper is already published, but the extension that we're working, I'm working with a paper with my colleague Yao Yu, which are more exciting right now. We are extending this to all developing country regions. The other thing that we are doing, we're using GIS mapping, and this is a separate project. We're looking at pockets of conflict in Africa. We're using GIS mapping, location mapping, and try to quantify the long-run impact of civil conflict, economic impact on African economies. Even as few as they are, they still have some long-term economic impact.
Okay.
So anyway, thank you so much for listening. If you have any question, you can. This is time.
Andrew, thank you for your presentation. You and your colleagues make some important points. I have a question. First of all, from table 1, I understand that you are using a weight matrix with 3 neighbors, right?
Yes.
And it is a binary weight matrix, so you do some kind of row standardization.
Yes.
Then my question is, how do you handle the countries which have more than 3 countries, more than 3 neighbors?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. So if you look at this pairwise correlation between countries, you try to quantify both the indirect and direct effects and you're looking countries pairs by pairs, it becomes, it's not going to be tractable. It becomes really, really complicated model. So for tractability, what we do, when you take the partial derivatives of your SLX model, okay, yeah, you end up with, that the diagonal elements are going to be your direct effect estimates, but then the off-diagonal elements are going to be the spillover effect. So what we do, we raw standardize those, we average for all countries. You get the average for this. This is a big thing, actually. Jim Lesage, actually, in their paper with Kelly, a book with Kelly Pace, they talked a lot about this standardization of the diagonal elements and even the off-diagonal elements. Because if you do pairwise correlation, it's a 43 by 43 matrix, because there are 43 countries. It's going to be, that becomes really complicated, and you can't track that. Yeah. So for simplicity, we do that normalization on our diagonal and off-diagonal elements. Yes.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question? Any question?
Hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation and very careful analysis. And I have a general question, actually, but I see that there are a few questions in the comment part as well.
Can I interrupt, Burak?
Yeah.
The way, can you guys, if there are questions on the comment section, I cannot control that in this room. This is a high-tech room. I'm sitting far away from the computer, so I'm not looking at the computer screen, so can you save those, because, can you save those, copy them on the comment section and maybe send it to me? Later, because I can't see those comments directly.
Okay, maybe by message or something. But I have just a very broad question regarding the impact of democracy. You already explained it a bit, but I'm just curious about what might be the reason behind this non-linear relationship. To me, having a better impact of FDI on growth in autocratic countries is a bit counterintuitive to be. So just, I know you don't analyze it, like you don't really look into the mechanisms, but just any further thoughts on it? That's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a wonderful question, and I talked quite a little bit of it when I was, when you go to the history of some of these, like post-independent Africa, there are countries that have had like brutal dictators or autocratic regimes, right? I'm gonna give a few examples, like Libya. The fact that the country has got an autocrat, a dictator, sometimes doesn't necessarily mean that the country is unstable. Dictators are, because they use their powers to suppress everybody in the country. Like that's exactly what Libya did, like Gaddafi did in Libya. So maybe it brings some elements of stability, so that people are not, think about if Gaddafi was president of Libya, would you protest on the street? You wouldn't, right? So there's not a lot of, because they tend to suppress, that's why they're brutal autocrats, and that's why the ranking is from 1 to 10 is for a reason. If you're more skewed toward a 1, that means your regime is really brutal. You suppress all the voices in your society. But you also bring stability. The people are not burning things on the street or protests, violent protests, because you're really brutal. But the question is, if you try to move away from that, what I would argue is that you try to break that dictatorship, like immediately. The move from that extreme dictatorship to some kind of moderate democracy might be murky, might bring instability in a country. And we all saw what happened in Libya, when Gaddafi was killed, and then, and you have protests all over the country, everything is a mess. And it's not yet stable in India up to today, ever since that happened, that event happened. The same with Egypt, right? Even though I'm not looking at North African countries in my sample, but that is true for other sub-Saharan African countries. Like if you have some dictator which might have ruled. I'm not saying I'm not in support for dictatorship. I want to make that very clear. But what I'm saying is that extreme dictatorship. Okay, there's also what we call being a dictator and being a benevolent dictator. Those are two different things. So for the case of Gaddafi, he was more like a benevolent dictator. He actually builds stuff. He builds institutions. He builds infrastructure in his country. So, but there are dictators that might be embrace corruption that may not be as benevolent as the rest of the others who can bring stability. So there's maybe that could be another good research question. One could actually look at different democratic regimes, changes in democratic regimes in Africa as a whole, and to come up with some measure of stability. How stable is it when a country moves from purely autocratic to a moderate, then to a highly democratic regime? What are the instability that come with that type of movement? Maybe that would be something very interesting, which we don't currently address in this paper. But that's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any other question? I guess we don't have. Thank you, Andrew, for your nice presentation. I like your paper very much. I'm sure all the listeners like it. Ladies and gentlemen, the guest presenter of the fourth event of the academic talks in economics was Andrew Ojede today. We will be more than happy to see you in our future events. I wish everyone to have a wonderful day. Bengi, if you want to say anything.
I just want to thank you for joining, Andrew, again. So as Burak told, we are going to meet all of you if you want to join. This will be, I guess, in 1 month. I'm not sure, but we will make the announcement. So
yeah. I will get. I think Burak can always. I'm always in close contact with Burak.
Yeah.
By the way, for your information, Burak was my classmate at the
PhD.
PhD.
From graduate school.
So he's one of my PhD classmate. Was very nice to me.
Thank you. You too.
It was nice to him too. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you. Well,
so I think Burak is always going to be able to alert me and let me know. We also have like a seminar series in my department. We bring outside speakers, sometimes from out of the country. We have brought very good speakers like this semester. Where we present our ongoing research within our department and within our college, so you can get immediate feedback from your colleagues, then sometimes we invite. So I was talking to some of my colleagues earlier, and I said, this is actually a wonderful thing that we can get this multi-university structure in our presentation. We get a couple of universities in Europe. We can always join you guys and see how we can we can collaborate, this type of presentations.
It will be great. We will be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, that would be something very, very interesting. So we can share insight. Maybe this could, it could result into co-authorship. Somebody might say, well, maybe we could extend this paper in a different direction. That's how we find co-authors in projects. We work together, to get more pubs out there. Yeah.
exactly. Thank you. So for all the,
No problem. I really appreciate. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to
for
be
joining us, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
nice evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.